There are maps we never see. There are stories we never hear. And there are faces that have been erased from humanity's collective memory. This is not just a documentary about the past. It is a restoration, a rescue, a resurrection. Imagine for a moment the Europe you know from books, from movies, from Renaissance paintings. A Europe of pale kings, of knights in shining armor, of castles erected under gray skies. Now, erase that image, because it is an invention, a careful fabrication, constructed over centuries of revisionism, whitewashing, and intentional forgetting. The true Europe, ancient Europe, medieval Europe, was a continent where dark-skinned kings ruled vast empires, where African armies crossed mountains and seas, where science, philosophy, and art flourished under the command of men who came from the south, from the desert, from the Nile, from the lands the Greeks called Ethiopia, and that the Romans feared and admired in equal measure. This documentary is not a theory. It is not speculation. It is evidence. Chronicles written by Christian monks who described rulers black as night. Statues of African saints still venerated in European cathedrals. Coats of arms of noble families that proudly display the image of Moorish kings. Modern DNA revealing African lineages deeply rooted in European blood. Arabic, Persian, and Byzantine records speaking of black dynasties that dominated the Mediterranean. And Norse sagas mentioning the black strangers who came from the south and became part of Viking legend. Why were these stories buried? Why did Europe choose to forget that its light came from Africa? The answer is simple and brutal. Because the narrative of white supremacy, constructed from the 15th century onward, required a purified past, a mythical origin, an invented genealogy. But truth does not die. It hibernates, it waits, and it returns, like the sun after a long eclipse. And this is the moment of return. Prepare yourself to walk through 10th century Córdoba, when it was the most advanced city in the world. Ruled by caliphs of African descent, prepare yourself to witness Tariq ibn Ziyad's crossing of the Strait of Gibraltar, leading an army of Berbers and Sudanese that would change the face of the Iberian Peninsula forever. Prepare yourself to meet Yusuf ibn Tashfin, the emperor of the desert, who saved Al-Andalus and expanded the Moorish Empire to the borders of France. Prepare yourself to explore Black Sicily, where African governors transformed Palermo into a jewel of the Mediterranean. Prepare yourself to hear the Viking sagas speak of the Dube Gale, the black warriors who sailed alongside the Norse and left their mark on the British Isles. And prepare yourself to rediscover Homer's blameless Ethiopians, the people loved by the Greek gods, the people Zeus visited to feast, because this is not the story of an invasion. It is the story of a civilization. This is not the story of a forgotten people. It is the story of an erased people. And now, we are rewriting the map of Europe, with African ink, with Moorish blood, with the truth that should never have been silenced. Welcome to ancient Black Europe. And if stories like this awaken something within you, the lost voices, the forgotten empires, the legends that time tried to bury, tell us in the comments which story, myth, or legend you would like us to bring to life next. Your voice guides our journey. Before Rome, before Athens, before any European king erected his first fortress, there was Kemet, there was Nubia, there was Kush, and there was Ethiopia. The first civilizations of the Mediterranean were not born in the north, they were born in the south, under the scorching African sun, where the Nile flowed like an artery of life, where stone temples defied time, and where scribes recorded knowledge that would later be called Greek miracles. But here is the uncomfortable truth. The truth that school textbooks avoid. Greece did not invent philosophy. It imported it. Rome did not create monumental engineering. It copied it. And Europe did not conceive science. It received it from African hands. Let us begin at the beginning. With the oldest texts in Western literature, Homer's Iliad and Odyssey, written in the 8th century before the Common Era. In them, we find an extraordinary passage, almost always ignored in modern analyses. Homer describes the Ethiopians, not as distant barbarians, but as the noblest people on earth, the blameless ones, those whom the gods themselves visited. Zeus, the king of the gods, regularly left Mount Olympus and traveled south to the lands of the Ethiopians, where he participated in a 12-day feast. It was not a casual visit. It was a regular event, repeated, revered. The gods went to Ethiopia to celebrate, to feast, to be among the blameless, those humans so pure, so virtuous, that the gods themselves chose them as company. And Zeus did not go alone. Hermes, the messenger of the gods, Poseidon, the god of the seas, all of them made the journey south. Homeric Ethiopia was not a place of savagery. It was a place of sanctity, a land where the human and the divine touched without mediation. This was not meaningless poetic rhetoric. It was a worldview. Ancient Greece, unlike modern Europe, did not see Africa as inferior. It saw it as origin, as source, as cradle. Herodotus, the Greek historian of the 5th century BCE, traveled extensively through Egypt and was impressed by what he found. He wrote that the Egyptians were black-skinned with woolly hair. He described them as the oldest people on earth. He stated that many Greek customs, including the worship of certain gods, had Egyptian origin. Herodotus was not inventing. He was reporting, and his words echo a truth that modern academia is reluctant to fully accept: that Greece, mother of Western civilization, was daughter of Africa. Aeschylus, the Greek playwright, wrote about Memnon, the Ethiopian hero who fought in the Trojan War alongside the Trojans. Memnon was described as the most beautiful and noble of warriors, son of Eos, the goddess of dawn. He was black, prince of Ethiopia, and his death at the hands of Achilles was mourned by the gods themselves. Memnon's story was not marginal. It was central to Greek mythology. He appears on vases, in sculptures, in lost texts we only know through fragments. And in all these representations, he is unequivocally African, dark-skinned, with black features, venerated as equal or superior to Greek heroes. There is also Andromeda, the Ethiopian princess. Daughter of Cepheus and Cassiopeia, she was chained to a rock as sacrifice to a sea monster and rescued by Perseus, the Greek hero, who married her. Andromeda was black. Greek sources are clear about this. And by marrying Perseus, she became ancestor to several Greek heroic lineages, including, according to some myths, the very line of Heracles. Africa was not outside Greek genealogy. It was within it, in the blood of heroes. And then there are the visual representations. Greek art, the vases, the amphorae, the craters. In museums throughout Europe, there are hundreds of ancient Greek vases depicting Africans, not as enslaved people, not as servants, but as warriors, athletes, musicians, and even as gods. A red figure vase from the 5th century BCE, found in Athens, shows a black youth participating in a symposium, reclining on a couch, drinking wine. Alongside Greeks, as an equal, another vase from the same period depicts an African boxer, muscular, powerful, competing in the Olympic Games. Because yes, Africans competed in the ancient Olympic Games and sometimes won. There are also representations of Heracles, the greatest Greek hero, in the company of Africans, not as subordinates, but as allies. On a particularly fascinating vase, Heracles fights alongside Ethiopian warriors against a common enemy, suggesting military alliances and mutual respect. But perhaps the most surprising, the most revealing, are the representations of Greek gods with African features. Zeus, in some archaic sculptures, has characteristics reminiscent of Egyptian deities. This is not coincidence. It is syncretism. Dionysus, the god of wine, of ecstasy, and of transformation, was often associated with Ethiopia and Egypt. He was seen as a god who came from the south, who brought with him African mysteries, who taught the Greeks to dance, to drink, to transcend. In various traditions, Dionysus was represented with dark skin, or accompanied by African satyrs and maenads. Greek religion, in its deepest layers, was saturated with African influence, and this extended to philosophy. Pythagoras, who founded a philosophical and religious school in southern Italy, spent 22 years in Egypt, according to ancient accounts, where he was initiated into the temple mysteries. His ideas about the transmigration of the soul, about the mathematical harmony of the cosmos, about the importance of spiritual purification, all have direct parallels with Egyptian doctrines. He did not invent, he translated Plato in his Timaeus, places the origin of his Atlantis myth in the mouths of Egyptian priests, who tell Solon, the Athenian legislator, "You Greeks are like children, always young, without ancient memory. We, the Egyptians, keep the records of the past." Plato openly acknowledged that Greek wisdom was derivative, secondary, that true antiquity, true knowledge, resided in Africa, and Aristotle, Alexander's tutor, though more Eurocentric than his predecessors, still admitted that the Egyptians had developed mathematics and astronomy before the Greeks. The Greek philosophical tradition, the one the West venerates as the foundation of its intellectual identity, was born under African tutelage. But then, something changed. As Greece became Rome, and Rome became Christian, and Christianity became Europeanized, admiration for Africa began to disappear. Homer's blameless Ethiopians became, centuries later, the sons of Ham, a supposedly cursed race. According to distorted interpretations of the Bible, respect transformed into contempt, veneration transformed into enslavement. But this did not happen in antiquity. It happened later, much later, during the late Middle Ages and the beginning of the modern era, when Europe needed to justify the transatlantic slave trade and fabricated an African inferiority that had never existed in ancient thought. The Greeks loved Africa, the Romans respected Africa, and medieval Europe, at least until the 14th century, still remembered this. (711) of the Common Era, the year Europe changed forever. The year a Berber general named Tariq ibn Ziyad crossed the strait separating Africa from the Iberian Peninsula and planted his sword in European soil. But before we speak of conquest, we need to understand who these men were, where they came from, what moved them, and why their arrival represented not just a military invasion, but a civilizational revolution. The Moors, that term Europe would use for centuries to describe the African and Arab conquerors, were not a single people. They were a coalition, an ethnic and cultural fusion. Berbers from the Maghreb, Arabs from the Arabian Peninsula, and sub-Saharan Africans from Sudan, the Sahara, and the lands south of the desert. Together, united by Islamic faith and the vision of expanding Dar al-Islam, they formed one of the most formidable armies the world has ever seen. Tariq ibn Ziyad, whose name would baptize the promontory of Jabal Tariq, Gibraltar, was a Berber from North Africa. But under his command were thousands of black warriors, men from the depths of the African continent, men whose dark skin would be recorded in Christian chronicles with a mixture of terror and fascination. When Tariq landed on the Iberian Peninsula, he did not encounter a powerful empire. He found a Visigothic kingdom in collapse, fragmented by civil wars, weakened by dynastic disputes, and plunged into the ignorance that characterized post-Roman Europe. King Roderick, last Visigothic monarch, hastily gathered an army to face the invaders. But at the Battle of Guadalete, in July 711, his forces were annihilated. Roderick disappeared in the chaos of battle, and with him, disappeared the last organized resistance to the Moorish advance. The conquest was swift, brutal, and nearly total. In less than 7 years, the Moors controlled almost the entire Iberian Peninsula, from Gibraltar to the Pyrenees. Cities capitulated, castles fell, and Christian Europe watched, astonished, as an Islamized African force established a new dominion on European soil. But here is what history books rarely emphasize. This was not destruction, it was construction. The Moors did not come to raise. They came to civilize. They brought with them something Europe had lost for centuries: knowledge, While Christian kingdoms could barely read, the Moors erected libraries. While Europe lived in wooden and mud huts, the Moors built palaces of marble and mosaics. While European peasants died of diseases they did not understand, Moorish physicians performed eye surgeries and wrote treatises on anatomy. The conquest of 711 was not just military, it was epistemological. The Moors did not just bring swords, they brought astrolabes, they brought algebra, they brought irrigation systems that would transform Iberian deserts into verdant gardens. They brought the music that would later be called flamenco. They brought spices, they brought paper, they brought translations of Greek texts Europe had forgotten. And they brought something more, something medieval Christianity considered dangerous. The idea that people of different religions and ethnicities could coexist. In the Caliphate of Al-Andalus, Jews, Christians, and Muslims lived side by side, not in perfect harmony, but in something Europe did not know: regulated coexistence, dhimma, where religious minorities paid taxes in exchange for protection and freedom of worship. This was unthinkable in Christian Europe, where religious orthodoxy was imposed with iron and fire. But among the Moors, diversity was tolerated, and sometimes even celebrated. The original capital of the Caliphate was established in Córdoba, a city that, under Moorish rule, would become the brightest in the West. But before we get there, we need to understand the ethnic composition of this new ruling elite. Because the chronicles are clear, frighteningly clear. Christian chroniclers describe the Moorish conquerors as dark-skinned men, black as coal, of African face. It was not rhetoric, it was observation. The armies that crossed the strait included massive contingents of sub-Saharan Africans, warriors who had traversed the Sahara, who came from the regions of Mali, Senegal, Sudan. They were not an exotic minority, they were a dominant force. And as the Moors established themselves on the peninsula, this African presence deepened. Mixed marriages were common. Black-skinned governors administered entire provinces. Moorish poets of African descent wrote in classical Arabic about love, war, and philosophy. Europe had never seen anything like it, and, for its own good, would choose to forget. But before forgetting would come splendor, the apex, the apogee, and that would happen in Córdoba, the city of light. 10th century of the Common Era. While most of Europe lived in darkness, literally and metaphorically, there existed a city that shone like a jewel in the heart of the Iberian Peninsula. Córdoba, the capital of the Umayyad Caliphate of Al-Andalus, the most advanced city in the West, and possibly in the entire world, a metropolis of 500,000 inhabitants. When London barely had 10,000, a city with public street lighting. When Paris was a dark and filthy labyrinth, a city with libraries containing hundreds of thousands of manuscripts. When the largest Christian library in Europe had fewer than 100 books. Córdoba was not just a city, it was a statement, living proof that Africa and Islam had surpassed Europe in every aspect of human civilization. And in command of this marvel were caliphs of African descent, men whose dark skin was frequently mentioned in historical records, not as curiosity, but as fact. Abd al-Rahman III, who ruled from 912 to 961, is perhaps the most fascinating example. He ascended to power at a time of crisis, when Al-Andalus was fragmented by internal revolts and external threats. But in just a few decades, he transformed the emirate into a caliphate, declaring himself Amir al-Mu'minin, commander of the faithful, directly challenging the Abbasid Caliphate of Baghdad. Arabic and Christian chronicles describe Abd al-Rahman III in remarkable detail. His mother was an enslaved Basque woman, but his paternal grandmother was a Nubian princess of profoundly black skin, and Abd al-Rahman, according to sources, inherited her appearance. He had kinky hair, dark skin, and light eyes, a combination that caused admiration and astonishment. Some historians have tried to whiten him over the centuries, but primary sources do not lie. He was visibly African, and under his rule, Córdoba reached its apex. The Great Mosque of Córdoba, still today one of Europe's most impressive structures, was expanded under his command. Its horseshoe arches, its marble columns, its golden mosaics, all reflected the fusion between Islamic aesthetics and African heritage. The city had more than 300 mosques, 50 hospitals, and countless public schools. The concept of universal education, something Europe would only adopt centuries later, was already reality in Córdoba. Boys and girls, Muslims, Jews, and Christians learned to read and write, something unthinkable in neighboring Christian kingdoms, where even kings signed documents with an X. The Caliphate's library, founded by Al-Hakam II, son of Abd al-Rahman III, contained more than 400,000 volumes. There were catalogs with 44 volumes just to index the books. Scribes worked day and night translating Greek, Persian, Indian, and Chinese texts into Arabic. Aristotle, Plato, Galen, Ptolemy, all were resurrected in Al-Andalus, while Christian Europe had completely forgotten them. And it was not just preservation. It was innovation. Moorish physicians like Abul Qasis, al-Zahrawi, performed complex surgeries. He invented more than 200 surgical instruments, many still used today. He wrote a 30-volume medical encyclopedia that would be mandatory text in European universities for centuries. Moorish astronomers corrected Greek calculations, created precise astronomical tables, and built observatories that rivaled those of Persia. The very word astronomy carries Arabic heritage, as do algebra, algorithm, alchemy, alcohol, words that Europe adopted because they were concepts Europe did not possess. But what most impresses, what most reveals the nature of this civilization, is the aesthetics, the beauty, the sensuality that permeated everything. The gardens of Córdoba were legendary. The palace of Medina Azahara, built by Abd al-Rahman III for his favorite concubine, was a complex of unimaginable luxury. Fountains flowed perfumed water. Marble courtyards reflected sunlight. Pavilions adorned with gold and ivory hosted banquets where poets recited verses in classical Arabic. The Moorish court was a melting pot of cultures: Berbers, Arabs, Sub-Saharan Africans, Sephardic Jews, Mozarabic Christians, all contributed to a cultural effervescence without parallel. And the physical appearance of this elite was diverse. Christian ambassadors who visited Córdoba were impressed, and sometimes horrified, by the sight of black-skinned Moorish nobles, dressed in silks and brocades, speaking eloquently about philosophy and sciences. Christian chroniclers, unable to deny what they saw, described rulers with skin dark as ebony, with curly black hair, with eyes golden as honey. It was not fantasy. It was documented reality. And then came Almanzor, Abu Amir Muhammad al-Mansur, the victorious. He was not caliph. He was Hajib, a kind of prime minister. But in practice, he was the true ruler of Al-Andalus between 978 and 1002. Almanzor conducted more than 50 military campaigns against the Christian kingdoms of the north, and was never defeated. He sacked Barcelona, destroyed Santiago de Compostela, the spiritual heart of Iberian Christianity, and took the cathedral bells as trophy to Córdoba, where they were transformed into lamps for the great mosque. Under Almanzor, the presence of sub-Saharan African warriors increased dramatically. He recruited thousands of soldiers from Sudan, from the Sahara, forming elite units that terrorized Christian armies. These men were not faceless mercenaries. They were figures of prestige, commanders, advisors, and their loyalty guaranteed the caliphate's stability for decades. But like every civilization, Córdoba carried the seeds of its own fall. After Almanzor's death, the caliphate began to fragment. Civil wars, Berber revolts, dynastic disputes. In 1031, the Caliphate of Córdoba officially collapsed, dissolving into dozens of smaller kingdoms. The Taifas. But the story of the Moors did not end there, because from the desert, from the depths of the Sahara, would come a new power, a new wave, and this time, it would be even more African. (1086) of the Common Era. Al-Andalus was dying. The great caliphate had shattered into small kingdoms. The Taifas, each ruled by weak princes, more interested in poetry and pleasure than in defending their lands. And from the north, like hungry wolves, came the Christian kings, Alfonso VI of Castile, leading the Reconquista, city by city, fortress by fortress. In 1085, he conquered Toledo, the ancient Visigothic capital, and panic swept through the Moorish kingdoms. They knew they could not resist alone, and so they did something desperate, something that would change everything. They asked for help from the desert. They asked for help from the Almoravids, and the man who answered the call was Yusuf ibn Tashfin, a Sanhaja Berber from the Sahara, with black skin, penetrating eyes, and unshakable faith. Yusuf was not a caliph of golden palaces. He was not a poet of refined verses. He was a desert warrior, a Sufi ascetic, a man who slept on the ground, ate bread and dates, and considered the luxury of Al-Andalus a corruption of Islam. But he was also a military genius, and the leader of the greatest empire in West Africa since ancient times. The Almoravid Empire, which stretched from Senegal to the Maghreb, from the Sahara to the gates of Europe. The Almoravids, Almurabitun, those of the Ribat, were a dynasty born from the fundamentalist religious movement led by Abdullah ibn Yasin, a preacher who unified the Berber tribes under the banner of rigorous Islam. They emerged from the desert in the 11th century, conquered Marrakesh, and built an empire based on military discipline, spiritual devotion, and holy war. Under Yusuf ibn Tashfin, this empire reached its apex. And now, he was about to cross the strait to save Al-Andalus, or conquer it. The kings of the Taifas, especially Al-Mutamid of Seville, knew the risk. There was a famous saying attributed to Al-Mutamid: "I would rather be a camel herder in the Sahara than a swineherd in Castile." In other words, he preferred to submit to Yusuf than to Alfonso. And so, in 1086, Yusuf ibn Tashfin crossed the Strait of Gibraltar with an army of 15,000 warriors, desert Berbers, sub-Saharan soldiers, Nubian archers, Tuareg cavalry dressed in black veils. They landed in Algeciras and marched north to face the largest Christian army ever assembled on the Iberian Peninsula. Alfonso VI, confident he would finally expel the Moors from Spain, gathered a coalition from Castile, Aragon, Leon, and even Frankish mercenaries. He marched with more than 60,000 men, knights in heavy armor, infantry with spears and shields. It was an overwhelming force, or so he thought. The two armies met at Sagrajas, also called Zalaka, near Badajoz, on October 23, 1086. The battle began at dawn. Christian forces attacked first, hurling themselves against Muslim lines with medieval fury. The soldiers of the Taifas, poorly trained and little motivated, began to retreat. Alfonso could already taste victory, but then something happened, something he had never seen. From the southern flank emerged the Almoravid cavalry, mounted on swift desert horses, dressed in black, with war drums thundering like storms. They struck the Christian army from the rear. With devastating precision and speed, Nubian archers launched clouds of arrows. Berbers attacked in coordinated waves, and in the center of the chaos was Yusuf ibn Tashfin, at 79 years of age. Personally commanding the assault, the battle transformed into massacre. Alfonso VI was gravely wounded, barely saving himself, carried from the battlefield by his most loyal knights. Of 60,000 Christian soldiers, only about 500 survived. The rest, dead, captured, or in desperate flight. Sagrajas was one of the most devastating defeats of medieval Christianity, and it established Yusuf ibn Tashfin as the savior of Al-Andalus. But Yusuf was not satisfied merely to save the Moorish kingdoms. He looked at the princes of the Taifas, with their decadence, their intrigues, their pleasure palaces, and saw weakness, corruption, betrayal of true Islam. And in 1090, he returned, this time not as ally, but as conqueror. One by one, the Taifas fell under his dominion. Granada, Malaga, Seville, Córdoba. The princes were deposed, some exiled, others imprisoned, and Al-Andalus was absorbed into the Almoravid Empire. For the first time since the collapse of the Caliphate, the Iberian Peninsula was again under a single Muslim government, and that government was profoundly African. Yusuf brought with him the desert's austerity, but also military efficiency, administrative discipline, and the spiritual devotion that characterized the Almoravids. He built mosques, strengthened defenses, and brought Maliki jurists to restore what he saw as the purity of Islam. The African presence in Al-Andalus, which was already significant, intensified even further. Black soldiers from the Sahara and Sudan became the backbone of the Almoravid army on the peninsula. Berber and African governors administered the provinces, and Moorish culture, already a fusion of Arabic, Berber, and Iberian, acquired an even more African character. Christian chroniclers, terrified and fascinated, described the Almoravids as black men from the desert, warriors with dark skin and eyes of fire, a people coming from the depths of Africa. And they were not wrong. Yusuf ibn Tashfin ruled until his death in 1106. At over 100 years of age, he left an empire that stretched from Spain to Senegal, and he left a lesson Europe would never forget: that Africa was not just a source of enslaved people, but of emperors. But while the Almoravids dominated the Iberian Peninsula, another African story was unfolding. Further east, on an island that would be the heart of an even more exotic Moorish kingdom, Sicily. (827 of the Common Era). A fleet departs from Tunis, crosses the Mediterranean, and lands on the southern coast of Sicily, led by Asad ibn al-Furat, an Arab judge and general. 10,000 Muslim warriors begin the conquest of the island that would be, for more than 2 centuries, an African and Arab kingdom in the heart of Europe. Sicily, the largest island in the Mediterranean, had been Greek, Roman, Byzantine, but now it would be Moorish, and under Islamic rule, it would flourish as never before, transforming into one of the most brilliant cultural jewels of the Middle Ages. The conquest was not quick, nor easy. The Byzantines resisted fiercely. Syracuse, the ancient Greek capital, only fell in 878 after a brutal siege. But when the island was finally pacified, the Moors did not destroy it. They rebuilt it, reimagined it, transformed it. Palermo, until then a provincial Byzantine city, became the capital of the Emirate of Sicily, and began its metamorphosis into one of the most cosmopolitan cities of the medieval world. Under the rule of emirs like Hassan al-Kalbi, who ruled in the 10th century, Palermo exploded in splendor. Mosques rose in every neighborhood, more than 300. According to Arab chroniclers, palaces with marble courtyards and murmuring fountains emerged in the urban landscape. Exotic gardens, with plants brought from Africa and the Orient, perfumed the air. Orange trees, lemon trees, jasmines, palm trees. The city had more than 250,000 inhabitants, a metropolis that rivaled Córdoba and Baghdad. And just as in Al-Andalus, the population of Moorish Sicily was ethnically diverse. Arabs, Berbers, Sub-Saharan Africans, converted Greeks, Jews, and Christians who maintained their faith under Islamic rule. But what historical records make clear, especially those written by Christian and Arab chroniclers, is that many of the governors and emirs of Sicily were of African descent. Visibly black, Hassan al-Kalbi's, the great emir, was described as a man of very dark skin, possibly of Berber or Sudanese origin. He expanded Sicilian power, not just within the island, but throughout the Mediterranean. The Sicilian fleet attacked the coasts of mainland Italy, sacked Byzantine cities, and established trading posts in Sardinia and Corsica. The naval power of the Sicilian Moors was feared and respected. They dominated trade routes between Africa, the Middle East, and Europe. African gold flowed through Palermo, Chinese silk, Indian spices, ivory, amber. The city was a global hub, where merchants from 3 continents traded in Arabic, Greek, Latin, and African languages. And it was not just trade, it was culture, knowledge, art. The court of the Sicilian emirs was a center of learning, Arab poets composed refined verses. Astronomers observed the heavens and compiled star charts. Physicians practiced advanced surgeries and studied human anatomy. Geographers like Al-Idrisi, who would come later, would produce maps that revolutionized European understanding of the world. But what most reveals the character of this civilization, is the architecture. The Moorish palaces of Palermo were masterpieces of Islamic aesthetics fused with African and Mediterranean influences. Lazisa, a palace built in the 12th century, still exists today, with its internal fountains, its intricate mosaics, its shaded gardens, a tangible echo of Moorish sophistication. Christian churches built later, after the Norman reconquest, still bear the mark of Moorish art. The Palatine Chapel in Palermo, built by the Normans, has a wooden ceiling carved by Moorish artisans, with inscriptions in Arabic and African geometric motifs. Because the Normans, when they conquered Sicily in the 11th century, did not destroy Moorish culture. They absorbed it, admired it, and preserved it. Roger II, the Norman king, dressed in Moorish clothing, maintained a personal guard of African soldiers, and employed Arab scribes in his court. He commissioned the Book of Roger, a world atlas compiled by Al-Idrisi, a Muslim geographer born in Morocco, who lived in Norman Sicily. This map, called Tabula Rogeriana, was the most accurate in the medieval world, and would remain so for centuries. But let us return to the Sicilian Moors themselves. During the 2 centuries of Islamic rule, Sicily was not just an outpost, it was a laboratory of civilization. Agriculture was revolutionized. The Moors introduced complex irrigation systems, inspired by African and Persian techniques, that transformed Sicily into one of the most productive granaries in Europe. They brought the cultivation of sugarcane, cotton, citrus fruits, rice, plants that would later spread across the continent, changing the European diet forever. And the Sicilian language, to this day, carries hundreds of words of Arabic origin, a living testament that the Moors were not just passing conquerors, but architects of a new cultural identity. But like all civilizations, the Emirate of Sicily had its end. In 1061, the Normans began the invasion, led by Roger de Hauteville. They conquered the island city by city. In 1091, Noto, the last Moorish fortress, fell, and Islamic Sicily came to an end. But the Moors did not disappear. Many remained. Converted or as tolerated minorities, their artisans continued to build. Their physicians continued to heal. Their poets continued to write. And their blood, their DNA, remained on the island, mixed with that of the Normans, the Greeks, the Romans, modern Sicily, with its population darker skinned than the rest of Italy, with its traditions that echo Africa, with its architecture that still whispers in Arabic, is living proof that Black Europe is not a myth. It is history, written in stone, sung in melodies, and engraved in the blood of millions. But while the Moors dominated southern Europe, something surprising was happening in the north. In the frozen lands of Scandinavia, where the last place one would expect to find Africans, would become the stage for one of the most fascinating stories of Black presence in Europe. The Norse sagas, those Icelandic epics written between the 12th and 14th centuries, are filled with gods, giants, dragons, and immortal heroes. But they also contain something modern historians rarely discuss: references to black-skinned men, African warriors, who sailed alongside the Vikings and left their mark on the frozen lands of northern Europe. They were called Dubgail, the black strangers, in contrast to the Fingail, the fair strangers. And although traditional interpretation suggests these words referred only to Danes and Norwegians, there is growing evidence, archaeological, linguistic, and genetic, that some of these black strangers were literally that black-skinned men from Africa, or descendants of Africans, who integrated into the commercial and military networks of the Norse. How is this possible? How did Africans reach Scandinavia? The answer lies in the trade routes of the Viking world. The Norse were not just barbaric raiders. They were sophisticated merchants, who sailed from Greenland to the Caspian Sea, from Iceland to Constantinople. They established the Volga route, which took them through Russia to the Islamic world, where they traded furs, amber, slaves, and swords in exchange for silver, silk, and spices. And it was on these routes, especially in the cities of the Abbasid Caliphate and the Moorish kingdoms, that the Vikings encountered Africans, Berber merchants, Sudanese soldiers, enslaved Nubians, and black-skinned Moorish nobles. Some of these Africans, through capture, trade, or alliance, ended up traveling back with the Vikings to the north. And there, in the cold and misty lands of Scandinavia, they settled, married, fought, and became part of Norse society. There are archaeological records that support this. In 2009, in the Swedish city of Sigtuna, archaeologists discovered human remains dating from the 10th century. DNA analysis revealed that some individuals had ancestry from North Africa and the Middle East. They were not exceptions. They were part of a vibrant commercial community. In Birka, the largest Viking trading center in Sweden, silk fabrics were found, Islamic coins, and jewelry of African origin, suggesting direct and continuous contact with the Moorish world. In Ireland, Celtic chronicles speak of the Dubgail, who arrived in the 9th century, and whom some historians believe included Africans or Moors who allied with the Vikings. The Annals of Ulster, written in Old Gaelic, mention battles between the Fingal and the Dubgail, and although traditionally interpreted as conflicts between Norwegians and Danes, there are passages suggesting deeper ethnic differences. In an entry from 851, it reads, "The black strangers defeated the fair strangers in naval battle," an enigmatic description, but one that raises questions. Who exactly were these black strangers? Some scholars propose they were Moors, or Africans who had joined Viking fleets, or even independent Moorish pirates operating in northern waters. In Scotland, in the Hebrides, there are legends about dark-skinned warriors who settled and married into local clans. The name Dubh, which means black in Gaelic, appears in several Scottish noble lineages, and although today it is interpreted as dark hair, there is evidence that originally it could have referred to skin color. But beyond Ireland and Scotland, there is another place where African presence in the Norse world becomes even more intriguing. Medieval heraldry. Throughout Europe, especially in Germany, Austria, and Scandinavian regions, there are coats of arms of noble families displaying the image of a Moor, a black man, usually with a crown, sometimes holding a sword or shield. These coats of arms were not rare. They were common. The most famous is the coat of arms of the city of Coburg in Bavaria, which displays the head of Saint Maurice, a Christian saint from the 3rd century. Represented as a black man, Saint Maurice, or Mauritius, was the leader of the Theban Legion, a Roman military unit composed entirely of Egyptian Christians, black, who were martyred for refusing to persecute other Christians. He became one of the most venerated saints of medieval Europe, especially in the Holy Roman Empire, and his iconography, during the Middle Ages, always portrayed him as a black-skinned man, dressed in armor, holding a lance. Cathedrals throughout Europe, from Magdeburg to Prague, have statues of Saint Maurice, clearly African. This was not symbolism, it was literal representation. Because medieval Europe did not have the systemic racism that would emerge later. Black nobles, black saints, black knights were respected figures. But let us return to the Vikings. There is also evidence of intermarriage between Norse and Africans, especially in the British Isles and France, where Vikings established lasting kingdoms. The Duchy of Normandy, founded by Vikings in the 10th century, was an ethnic melting pot. Normans, Franks, Bretons, and, possibly, Moors. There are French chronicles mentioning dark-skinned men among the Normans, and although this could refer to various ethnicities, the Moorish presence in France at the time makes it plausible that some were of African origin. Additionally, there are records of enslaved Moors brought by Vikings from their raids on the Iberian Peninsula and the Mediterranean. These captives did not remain in captivity forever. Many were freed, integrated into local communities, or even elevated to positions of trust. Because in the Viking world, loyalty and ability mattered more than skin color. There is also the fascinating case of Ahmad ibn Fadlan, an Arab traveler who encountered the Vikings on the Volga River in 922. He wrote extensively about the Rus, the Swedish Vikings who traded with the Abbasid Caliphate, and mentioned that among them were men of various ethnicities, including enslaved people and merchants from distant lands. Although Ibn Fadlan does not specifically mention Africans among the Rus, the diversity he describes suggests that Viking networks were ethnically varied, much more than the popular image of blonde-haired, blue-eyed men suggests. And finally, there is modern genetics. DNA studies in Scandinavian and British populations have revealed traces of North African and Middle Eastern ancestry, dating from medieval periods. This does not prove, by itself, the presence of Moors among the Vikings, but combined with archaeological evidence, linguistic, and historical, it paints a convincing picture. The Vikings did not live isolated in the frozen north. They were part of a global network. And in that network, Africans and Norse met, traded, fought, and sometimes became one. Before Rome, before Alexander, before Athens even erected the Parthenon, there was a belief deeply rooted in the Greek mind that Africans were the most favored by the gods. They were called blameless Ethiopians, Ethiopes, which literally means burnt faces, a term the Greeks used to describe all black-skinned peoples from the south, whether from Egypt, Nubia, or the mysterious lands beyond the desert. And in the oldest texts of Western literature, these Ethiopians were not portrayed as inferior, nor as distant exotics, but as noble, pious, and intimately connected to the divine. In the Iliad, Homer's epic written around 750 BCE, there is an extraordinary passage, almost always ignored in modern analyses. Homer describes the Ethiopians not as distant barbarians, but as the noblest people on earth, the blameless ones, those whom the gods themselves visited. Zeus, the king of the gods, regularly left Mount Olympus and traveled south to the lands of the Ethiopians, where he participated in a 12-day feast. It was not a casual visit. It was a regular event, repeated, revered. The gods went to Ethiopia to celebrate, to feast, to be among the blameless, those humans so pure, so virtuous, that the gods themselves chose them as company. And Zeus did not go alone. Hermes, the messenger of the gods, Poseidon, the god of the seas, all of them made the journey south. Homeric Ethiopia was not a place of savagery. It was a place of sanctity, a land where the human and the divine touched without mediation. This was not meaningless poetic rhetoric. It was a worldview. Ancient Greece, unlike modern Europe, did not see Africa as inferior. It saw it as origin, as source, as cradle. Herodotus, the Greek historian of the 5th century BCE, traveled extensively through Egypt and was impressed by what he found. He wrote that the Egyptians were black-skinned with woolly hair. He described them as the oldest people on earth. He stated that many Greek customs, including the worship of certain gods, had Egyptian origin. Herodotus was not inventing. He was reporting, and his words echo a truth that modern academia is reluctant to fully accept. That Greece, mother of Western civilization, was daughter of Africa. Aeschylus, the Greek playwright, wrote about Memnon, the Ethiopian hero who fought in the Trojan War alongside the Trojans. Memnon was described as the most beautiful and noble of warriors. Son of Eos, the goddess of dawn. He was black, prince of Ethiopia, and his death at the hands of Achilles was mourned by the gods themselves. Memnon's story was not marginal. It was central to Greek mythology. He appears on vases, in sculptures, in lost texts we only know through fragments, and in all these representations, he is unequivocally African, dark-skinned, with black features, venerated as equal or superior to Greek heroes. There is also Andromeda, the Ethiopian princess, daughter of Cepheus and Cassiopeia. She was chained to a rock as sacrifice to a sea monster and rescued by Perseus, the Greek hero, who married her. Andromeda was black. Greek sources are clear about this, and by marrying Perseus, she became ancestor to several Greek heroic lineages, including, according to some myths, the very line of Heracles. Africa was not outside Greek genealogy. It was within it, in the blood of heroes. And then there are the visual representations. Greek art, the vases, the amphorae, the craters. In museums throughout Europe, there are hundreds of ancient Greek vases depicting Africans, not as enslaved people, not as servants, but as warriors, athletes, musicians, and even as gods. A red figure vase from the 5th century BCE, found in Athens, shows a black youth participating in a symposium, reclining on a couch, drinking wine, alongside Greeks, as an equal. Another vase from the same period depicts an African boxer, muscular, powerful, competing in the Olympic Games, because yes, Africans competed in the ancient Olympic Games, and sometimes won. There are also representations of Heracles, the greatest Greek hero, in the company of Africans, not as subordinates, but as allies, on a particularly fascinating vase. Heracles fights alongside Ethiopian warriors against a common enemy, suggesting military alliances and mutual respect. But perhaps the most surprising, the most revealing, are the representations of Greek gods with African features. Zeus, in some archaic sculptures, has characteristics reminiscent of Egyptian deities. This is not coincidence. It is syncretism. Dionysus, the god of wine, of ecstasy, and of transformation, was often associated with Ethiopia and Egypt. He was seen as a god who came from the south, who brought with him African mysteries, who taught the Greeks to dance, to drink, to transcend. In various traditions, Dionysus was represented with dark skin, or accompanied by African satyrs and maenads. Greek religion, in its deepest layers, was saturated with African influence, and this extended to philosophy. Pythagoras, who founded a philosophical and religious school in southern Italy, spent 22 years in Egypt, according to ancient accounts, where he was initiated into the temple mysteries. His ideas about the transmigration of the soul, about the mathematical harmony of the cosmos, about the importance of spiritual purification, all have direct parallels with Egyptian doctrines. He did not invent, he translated Plato. In his Timaeus, places the origin of his Atlantis myth in the mouths of Egyptian priests, who tell Solon, the Athenian legislator, "You Greeks are like children, always young. Without ancient memory, we, the Egyptians, keep the records of the past." Plato openly acknowledged that Greek wisdom was derivative, secondary, that true antiquity, true knowledge, resided in Africa, and Aristotle, Alexander's tutor, though more Eurocentric than his predecessors, still admitted that the Egyptians had developed mathematics and astronomy before the Greeks. The Greek philosophical tradition, the one the West venerates as the foundation of its intellectual identity, was born under African tutelage. But then, something changed. As Greece became Rome, and Rome became Christian, and Christianity became Europeanized, admiration for Africa began to disappear. Homer's blameless Ethiopians became, centuries later, the sons of Ham, a supposedly cursed race, according to distorted interpretations of the Bible. Respect transformed into contempt, veneration transformed into enslavement. But this did not happen in antiquity. It happened later, much later, during the late Middle Ages and the beginning of the modern era, when Europe needed to justify the transatlantic slave trade and fabricated an African inferiority that had never existed in ancient thought. The Greeks loved Africa, the Romans respected Africa, and medieval Europe, at least until the 14th century, still remembered this. Official history may have erased the Moors from European narratives, but popular memory, festivals, symbols, and even the DNA of modern Europeans, tell a different story, a story that cannot be silenced, because it is engraved in the flesh, in traditions, and in the stones of cities. Let us begin with festivals. Throughout Spain, especially in regions that were the heart of Al-Andalus, there are annual celebrations called Moros y Cristianos, Moors and Christians. These festivals, which have been happening for centuries, reenact the battles between Moorish and Christian armies during the Reconquista. Thousands of people wear elaborate costumes, some representing Christian knights, others representing Moorish warriors. And here's the fascinating detail. The Moors are not portrayed as villains. They are not demonized. They are celebrated, respected, admired. Participants representing the Moors wear exotic clothing, colorful, often with turbans and capes. And in many of these festivals, they paint their faces dark or wear black masks to represent the skin of the African conquerors in cities like Alcoy, Ontinyent, Villena, and dozens of others. These celebrations are not marginal events. They are the cultural heart of the community. Children grow up hearing stories of the Moors, learning their dances, memorizing their war cries. And although the festival always ends with Christian victory, symbolic, there is a deep respect, almost a nostalgia, for the defeated Moors. Because in the Spanish popular imagination, the Moors were not just enemies. They were part of national identity. They brought science, art, architecture, music, and even centuries after their expulsion, Spain still remembers them, still celebrates them, still honors them. But it is not only in Spain. In Portugal, in the Algarve region, which owes its name to the Arabic Algarb, the West, there are similar celebrations and local legends about Moorish princesses, hidden treasures, and underground palaces where the Moors still dwell, waiting for the day to return. In Sicily, the Festa di Santa Rosalia in Palermo, although Christian on its surface, incorporates elements of Moorish culture, music, dance, and even food that are clearly inherited from the centuries of Islamic rule. Sicilian cuisine itself, with its rice dishes, saffron, almonds, and candied fruits, is a direct legacy of the Moors. And then there are the symbols, the heraldry, the coats of arms. Throughout Europe, but especially in Germany, Austria, and in the Holy Roman Empire, there are hundreds of coats of arms displaying the figure of a Moor, not as a defeated enemy, but as a symbol of nobility, power, and prestige. The city of Coburg, in Bavaria, has on its coat of arms the head of Saint Maurice, a black saint, represented with a crown. Freising, also in Bavaria, uses the image of a crowned Moor. And there are dozens of German noble families, the von Moor, the Moor, the Moritz, whose names derive directly from the word Moor, and whose coats of arms display African figures. Why? Because in the Middle Ages, having a Moor on a family's coat of arms was a sign of distinction, of contact with the civilized world, of participation in the Crusades, or of alliances with Moorish kingdoms. Having a Moor on your coat of arms was not shame, it was honor. And these images were not abstract. They were specific, detailed, faces of black men with clearly defined African features. In Prague, in St. Vitus Cathedral, there is a statue of Saint Maurice, dressed in medieval armor, holding a lance, and unmistakably black, carved in stone in the 13th century. In Magdeburg, in Germany, there is another statue of Saint Maurice, equally black, equally venerated. These were not symbolic saints. They were literal representations, because in medieval Europe, sanctity had no color, and neither did nobility. There are historical records of black knights, not just Moors, but African Christians, who served in European courts. One of the most famous is Alessandro de' Medici, Duke of Florence, who ruled from 1532 to 1537. He was a direct descendant of the Medici family, but his mother was an enslaved African woman, and Alessandro had dark skin and kinky hair. He was assassinated by a cousin, but not for his race, for politics. His blackness was not seen as an impediment to power, at least not at that time. There was also Juan Latino, an enslaved African who became a professor of Latin and Greek at the University of Granada. In the 16th century, he married a Spanish noblewoman, published books of poetry in Latin, and was celebrated as one of the most brilliant intellectuals of his time. And then, there is DNA, the most incontestable evidence of all. Modern genetic studies reveal that between 10% and 20% of the Iberian Peninsula's population has North African ancestry, especially in regions like Andalusia, Murcia, and southern Portugal. This ancestry is not recent. It dates back centuries. To Moorish times. In Sicily, DNA studies show significant mixing of North African and Middle Eastern genes, inherited from the centuries of Islamic rule. In Malta, a small Mediterranean island that was ruled by Arabs and Berbers for more than 2 centuries, the modern population carries clear African genetic markers. And even in Scandinavia, in populations of Sweden and Norway, there are traces of Middle Eastern and North African ancestry. Dating from the Viking era, genetics does not lie. The Moors did not just pass through Europe. They stayed, married, had children, and their lineages continue alive in millions of modern Europeans who will never know or never admit that they have African blood running through their veins. But beyond DNA, there are languages: Spanish, Portuguese, Sicilian, Maltese. All carry hundreds, sometimes thousands, of words of Arabic and Berber origin, everyday words that Europeans use without realizing they are speaking African and Arabic. Azul, blue, comes from Arabic lazaward, azúcar, sugar. From sukar, algodón, cotton. From al-qutn, arroz, rice. From aruz, limón, lemon, naranja, orange. Aceituna, olive. Almohada, pillow. Sastra, tailor. Alcohol, alchimia, alchemy. Algebra, algebra. All these words, and hundreds of others, are Moorish gifts to Europe. The very structure of European music was influenced by the Moors. Flamenco, Spain's most iconic music, is a fusion of Andalusian traditions, gypsy, and Moorish. Its complex rhythms, its modal scales, its clapping and footwork, all have African and Arabic roots. Portuguese fado, melancholic and deep, echoes Moorish lamentations, and even Italian opera, born in the Renaissance, was influenced by musical traditions brought by the Sicilian Moors. Architecture also speaks: the Alhambra in Granada, the Alcazar of Seville, the Mosque Cathedral of Córdoba, the Ziza Palace in Palermo. These structures are not just buildings, they are stone testimonies, irrefutable proof that Europe was, for centuries, profoundly African. And you cannot tear them down, cannot erase them, cannot pretend they do not exist. Tourists from all over the world visit these places every year, marvel at their beauty, take photos, and return home without ever really understanding that they are walking through African monuments on European soil. Because this is the final truth, the truth this documentary seeks to restore. Europe is not, and never was, exclusively white. It is a tapestry, woven with threads of all colors, and the African threads are among the strongest, the brightest, and the most enduring. And so, we reach the end of this journey, but not the end of the story, because history never ends. It only transforms, hides, or returns. What you have just witnessed is not an alternative narrative. It is not revisionism. It is not Afrocentric fantasy. It is the truth, documented, written in medieval chronicles, sculpted in cathedrals, woven in coats of arms, sung in popular festivals, and encoded in the DNA of millions of modern Europeans. Black Europe is not a myth. It is a historical fact that was systematically erased, whitewashed, buried under layers of revisionism, to sustain a narrative of racial supremacy that only emerged in the last 5 centuries. But why? Why did Europe choose to forget? The answer is simple and brutal. Because remembering would mean acknowledging that European civilization was not born in isolation. That the Renaissance was possible because the Moors preserved Greek knowledge. That medieval universities learned medicine and mathematics from Africans. That black kings ruled vast territories in the heart of Europe. And that the very idea of a superior white race is a recent invention, fabricated to justify the transatlantic slave trade, colonialism, and genocide. Before the 15th century, Europe did not see Africans as inferior. It saw them as different, sometimes as superior, often as equals. Saint Maurice was venerated, the Moors were respected, and Homer's blameless Ethiopians were considered the favorites of the gods. But when Europe began enslaving Africans on an industrial scale, when Columbus crossed the Atlantic and inaugurated the age of colonial exploration, when nascent capitalism demanded free labor for its plantations, a moral justification was needed. And that justification was scientific racism, the idea that Africans were biologically inferior, destined for slavery, cursed by God. This ideology required a purified past, a Europe that had always been white, an Africa that had always been savage. And so, the Moors were whitened in Renaissance paintings. Egyptian pharaohs were reinterpreted as white. Black saints were forgotten or reinterpreted. And the history of Black Europe was erased from the books. But truth does not die. It waits in the dusty archives of medieval monasteries, in Arabic chronicles never translated, in coats of arms still hanging in castles, in popular festivals celebrating Moors and Christians, and in DNA that cannot lie. And now, in the 21st century, this truth is returning. Archaeologists unearth African skeletons in Viking sites. Geneticists trace African lineages in European populations. Historians revisit ancient chronicles and find what was always there. Black Moors, Black kings, Black saints, Black knights. Europe is being forced to remember, and remembering is uncomfortable, because it challenges the foundational narrative of white supremacy. But it is necessary, because without it, there is no truth, no justice, no reconciliation. This documentary does not seek to blame modern Europe for its ancestors' sins, nor does it seek to glorify Africa at Europe's expense. The goal is simple: to restore balance, to retell history as it really happened, to celebrate African contribution to European civilization, and to remind the world that humanity has always been, and always will be, a tapestry of colors. Europe was not born white. It was born under the African sun, under the light of Kemet, under the knowledge of the Moors, under the sword of Tariq ibn Ziyad, under the rule of Yusuf ibn Tashfin, under the wisdom of philosophers who studied in Egypt, under the blessing of the blameless Ethiopians whom the Greek gods loved. And this Europe, the true Europe, multi-ethnic, multicultural, vibrant and diverse, has not disappeared. It is still here, in the streets of Córdoba, in the palaces of Palermo, in the coats of arms of Coburg, in the festivals of Alcoy, and in the blood of millions who carry African ancestry without knowing it. Forgetting is not natural. It is constructed, but memory is stronger. Truth returns, like the sun after a long eclipse. And now, the eclipse has ended. History does not belong to those who write it, but to those who remember. And we remember.